Hello and welcome to History After All. Today we will be doing our first exclusive with a very special guest. Zeynep and I will be hosting Alex Keuerleber, a very dear friend to me. We are taking a Cold War course together. We are doing a master's on war studies, and his paper was very interesting, and he was very passionate when I asked him about what he wrote on our Cold War course. So when he seemed and sounded a little bit passionate, I just took advantage of him, I guess, and asked him if he would be interested in talking about this on YouTube. And he very naively said yes. So thank you, many, many thanks, first of all. Also, many, many thanks for being our first ever guest, one in English, and second, our first exclusive with a guest we will be doing with Alex. Zeynep, hi. Alex, hi.
Hi, John, and hi, Alex. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We will be talking about the invasion of Grenada. I won't presume to be any kind of expert on the subject, so I won't go on rambling and I won't make this introduction too long. I will have a few questions. Zeynep, I think, will have a few questions. But Alex, from a very introductory standpoint, uh, what happened in Grenada and why?
So Grenada is that's how we Americans say it. Is so you'll be hearing that a lot. But it's a tiny little island in the Caribbean. Let me check how big it is. It is 344 square kilometers. It is pretty minuscule in the global scheme of things. And in 1983, the fall of 1983, a Marxist left-wing government came into power in Grenada and started cozying up with Cuba, as Cuba was offering aid and the U.S. wasn't. And the government of Grenada, while it was reaching out to the U.S., was being refused openly by the U.S. Was being refused aid. And so the buildup of Cuban aid and funds to the island led the U.S. to eventually use overwhelming force, and by overwhelming, it was very overwhelming. The Grenadians had 1,000 men, and the U.S. sent a whole carrier strike group, which is, 8, 10 ships, 100 planes, and who knows how many troops. They sent that to deal with the perceived threat to the United States and its security.
What was the US foreign policy on the Caribbean before that period, that timeline?
So it really varies. You see this even today. There's switches between Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. We have Reagan was president during the invasion of Grenada. He took a very, very hardline stance against Cuba and other left wing slash like perceived threats in the Caribbean, cracking down on them. He created the Caribbean Basin Initiative, which was a U.S. led trading organization, and that essentially was created to exclude communist and left leaning countries in the region and force them into economic hardship. But before the invasion, we see Jimmy Carter taking a more humanitarian stance. His presidency was very much oriented towards humanitarian need in the third world and the global south, regardless of belief system, regardless of if the government was communist, if it was left leaning, whatever it was, didn't matter. If there was aid to be given out, the U.S. would have come and helped. He was still harsh on Cuba, of course, especially given 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. is still feeling those effects, but he was a little bit more lenient, and willing to work with this left leaning government in Grenada that came to power in 79. I know I said earlier it was 83. That was a coup by a part of that left-leaning government to take control in a more rigid manner.
I was about to ask the same thing. What was Grenada's relationship with the whole region and US, and how did they become communist or how did they become socialist? And were they working very closely with Cuba?
So Grenada is it's a very, very interesting situation. You have in they were a British colony until the late 60s. I believe it was 1967. And then they became an associated state, which means they are essentially independent, but they are reliant on Great Britain for their military protection for their defense, right? After 1967, uh, the when the island became independent, we see the rise of Eric Gary. He was essentially a right-wing populist, and eventually became authoritarian. In the late 1970s, he switched from more populism towards authoritarianism. He still had U.S. backing. He was still pro-U.S., but before 1979, Grenada was this insignificant fleck in the Caribbean that just served essentially as a way to keep Cuba hemmed in the Caribbean in U.S. foreign policy. Once the government switched, once this coup happened in 1979, of course the left-leaning government is very anti-American and switches its interests, its ties to align more with Cuba and the Soviet Union. And then you see millions of dollars of aid flowing into Grenada from Cuba.
Uh, Before becoming more pro-Cuban, would could you or would you say the island in and of itself wasn't all that important? What was the geopolitical, geostrategic importance of Grenada?
Yeah, the island was really honestly insignificant before. I hate to say that, but it really was in the broader scheme of things, it was quite insignificant in the world of geopolitics before 1983. I mean, even when the US was invading, half the country didn't know where it was. And that says something, you know. But it essentially it's nothing more than it functioned as nothing more than, like I said, a buffer state to prevent Cuban expansionism throughout the English speaking Caribbean, since that was it was part of the outer islands there are mainly English speaking. So it was an effort to keep the communism and the left wing policies, tendencies of Cuba hemmed in.
Let's turn a bit inwards. What happened that led to Grenada turning leftist? What changed?
So, like I said earlier, Eric Gary, the right-wing leader of Grenada, was originally very much loved by the population, but as he became more of an egomaniac and more extreme, his policies became harsher, and he had almost like his own little Stasi, a group of military police he recruited in the last few months of his regime to essentially maintain peace and order. And they would go around, they established curfews and were very strict and very harsh on the people. And most of the money flowing into Grenada from the US, from the West, from wherever, was essentially going into his pockets. It wasn't going to the people. Yeah.
Quick question. Did he rely on the US? Because we generally see strongmen during the Cold War rely on the US for outer support, while they suppress their own people.
In a way, he did. He was a little bit more independent than most, but he was still very much reliant on U.S. aid, and U.S. obviously with it being within the U.S. sphere of influence, very much reliant on their assistance both economically and militarily. So he had these police gangs were essentially made up of his loyalists. They were called the Mongoose gangs, and they went around the island establishing these curfews, seeking out people who weren't listening to these curfews, weren't following the rules in general, not necessarily just the curfews through their actions and the lack of the economic aid and the money coming actually down to the people and not instead of into his pockets, into Gary's pockets, that led to the left wing, I guess the underground left wing at this point, to come together. It was two movements that came together to form the New Jewel movement. And the leader of the New Jewel movement was Maurice Bishop. He's the one who led the coup in 1979. And while Gary was away, actually in Washington D.C., funnily enough, they took power over the island, took control, and made a radio broadcast. And Gary had to stay in the U.S. I believe he was in San Diego.
What kind of administration came after that? How did the country change and adapt to this new administration? And how violent was the takeover? The initial leftist takeover, I mean, New Jewel
Yeah.
movement.
Yeah. So the takeover itself was actually quite peaceful. I believe there were only a few soldiers, a few right-wing soldiers killed while taking over a radio station. Other than that, it was a fairly peaceful takeover. It did, shock the Caribbean, shock the world. Nobody saw it coming. But in the grander scheme of things during the Cold War, it was a very peaceful takeover. And the left wing regime after that was also quite peaceful. They positioned themselves initially as part of the non-aligned movement. And Maurice Bishop made this very, very clear in many messages and speeches leading up to 1983, leading up to the invasion. Um, and it was a regime designed in a sense, as Maurice Bishop puts it, for the people. And it was very much almost a carbon copy of like Soviet agricultural economic policies in a way, with a little bit of Cuban influence, of course. But he very much followed the Marxist attitudes of the time and of the Soviet Union, almost to a T. And it worked for a while. Yeah.
Were the Cubans involved in the initial takeover? Were they aware that there was a movement that could take control of Grenada? Did they care?
Kind of. They were, of course, backing the New Jewel movement, even before the takeover. However, they didn't actually give them funds or anything. They said, if this works, we will help you. They didn't give any funds to the Grenadians, to the New Jewel movement, to Maurice Bishop. It was very much we're gonna back off, see what you do, and go from there situation. See how you do. If you're doing well, if the coup goes successfully, we will support you.
So it was a very local and very original in terms of its own population movement, the initial takeover.
Yeah.
It wasn't supported by the Cubans, or it wasn't instigated by the Cubans. It was a very real, rooted in the people's own, or at least the movement's own wants and needs kind of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's one of the few cases in the Cold War, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I believe it is one of the few cases in the Cold War where it's actually coming from the people. I mean, they obviously had the Cuban support, but there was no money coming in. There were no arms or anything. They used what they had on the island, and then they reached out for Cuban support.
At that point, do you know if there were any Cuban engineers or experts at that point before the takeover? It doesn't make sense.
I wouldn't I mean, I don't have the exact numbers. I don't think there would be any significant numbers that we would pay attention to. Obviously, afterwards there were a significant amount. But I think before the invasion, there really weren't many, maybe a few construction workers or something. But that's to be expected.
If I may, John, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think, if I were to comment on it, I think it was one of the reasons why America got so mad over it. It was real. It was a real kind of revolution, and it had roots in the people themselves. So I think it kind of freaked them out. The country, the Grenada itself, becoming another Cuba, another Soviet ally in the region.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That was the real fear of the Reagan administration, viewing Grenada as a second Cuba, somewhere where the Soviets can launch their bombers, launch their fighter aircraft, and the Cubans as well. And with expanding their influence, the Cubans at the same time as this was going on were very much active in the Angolan Civil War. And Grenada was the perfect stopover point for their planes to land, refuel, and keep going to Angola to support the rebels there as well.
Cubans sent as many as 15,000 troops to Angola. Am I mistaken?
I
So
believe I believe so, yeah.
it's a comically high number for a country like Cuba. That's why I remember, or I think I remember the number.
Yeah.
How did the overall situation, the geopolitical situation in the region change after the change of government, change of administration in Grenada?
It
How did
got
the US perception and policy change toward them?
Yeah, yeah. No, it got very, very tense. Not that it wasn't already tense with Cuba. And like I said earlier, Cuban Missile Crisis. After that, it had already been tense in the Caribbean. Relationships eased under Carter a bit, between Cuba and the U.S. But Grenada wasn't a factor, obviously, until 1979. But as soon as the coup happened, there was a noticeable switch. The U.S. was holding many more military exercises in the Caribbean, amphibious landings on islands, on Puerto Rican islands, with not so secret code names. The big ones being the Ocean Venture operations, namely Ocean Venture 81, where they had an amphibious landing to, I believe it was the name of it, the operation was Amber and the Amberdeens, or something along those lines. And the official name of Grenada is Grenada and the Grenadines. So it's very much a thinly veiled threat towards the rising Cuban influence and this revolution we see in Grenada as well. And this continues all the way up till 1983.
What was the turning point that led to the Operation Urgent Fury itself?
The turning point was essentially uh, Maurice Bishop, the New Deal movement leader, was began ramping up verbal attacks against the U.S. And he made speeches at the UN in New York. He visited the U.S. He traveled throughout the U.S. meeting with the significant Grenadian expat community, immigrant community in the U.S., riling them up, according to the Reagan administration, riling them up. And then this already had the U.S. on edge. And then the real kicker was that Grenada was looking to expand its tourism industry. And in order to do that, they needed a larger airport. And like I mentioned earlier, with the refueling and the potential basing of Soviet military aircraft and Cuban military aircraft on the island, the U.S. immediately viewed this new airport, this new runway, as a massive threat and as a Cuban military installation instead of simply something to boost the Grenadian economy. And that's when the U.S. itself started to respond more the same way essentially as Bishop did to them, more verbal attacks. If you look at Reagan's speeches from the time period, as soon as he gets to foreign policy, anytime between 1981, late 1981, all the way up until the invasion, if there's any element of foreign policy in any of his speeches, 90% of the time he mentions Grenada as the poster child for this growing Cuban threat within the region.
How important was Grenada really for the US foreign policy and for the US voters? Why would the US voters care about Grenada?
Well, like I said earlier, Grenada was essentially insignificant. The real push for the U.S. to go in was the Cuban assistance at the airport. There were 1,700 or so Cubans working at the airport as workers. They were trained militarily as well, but they were there as workers. That was their job. But the U.S. blew this out of proportion and said, "Oh, the Cuban army's there. They have all their weapons. They're bringing in. They were sending arms shipments. That's true to the island, but that was also part of their economic aid and building up a Grenadian army. But these workers were just there as simply as workers. There was no military anything to them. The only thing was that Castro said, if our people get attacked on the island as a result of an attack from the US, we will fight back." And that was essentially it. I think it was from the US side, it was mainly just fear mongering. If you look at it, Grenada is really like it's a tiny little island. If it's under Cuban control, if it's under US control or influence, it doesn't influence much besides this airstrip, and that was the main thing. And I'm sure I'll come back to it 10 20 times during this, but that was just the main thing, and everything else was just an overreaction from Reagan, even down to the amount of troops deployed in the invasion itself.
John, I'm sorry, you were gonna say something, but I think at that point, USSR had already had some ICBMs in hand, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and I think they didn't much need a country like Grenada to be, to house IRBMs or something, intermediate range missiles or something. As you said, fear mongering was a bit Reagan's specialty.
A simpler question derived from Zeynep's could be, where did the Soviets stand in all of this? Because we see, as in Chile, Cuban influence in Cuban foreign policy doesn't directly correlate to Soviet foreign policy. Were the Soviets as invested as Cubans? Were the Soviets invested in the situation in Grenada at all? Did they care at all?
So they were somewhat invested. Bishop and his group. Then they had an ambassador in Moscow. The Soviet Union was one of the first countries to establish an embassy after the coup. But honestly, the Soviet Union kind of took a back foot on this and gave it mainly to Cuba. Of course, they were still very much pro revolution. They were happy to see a left-wing government rising up in an area that they had struggled to get into, really, in the geopolitical sphere before Cuba. But other than that, they simply took a back foot. They were, and oftentimes, if you look at the records of the Grenadian ambassador in Moscow himself, he got a cold welcome a lot of times in Moscow. And wherever else he traveled, he went to East Germany, same thing, a fairly cold welcome. All these countries, of course, gave aid to Grenada. I believe the full list is Vietnam, North Korea, East Germany, the Soviet Union, and Cuba. Those are the big five that gave aid, and obviously Cuban aid was the overwhelming for the overwhelming share, as they were the ones responsible for the whole airport, and that was the biggest project that was ongoing.
Aside from the airport, do any instances of Cuban influence come to mind? Did they build anything as big, anything else as big? Were they effective in the administration aside from the airport and their existence on the island? Do we know if the Cubans were involved in anything else?
Well, they didn't build anything as big, but there were a significant amount of Cuban doctors on the island as well. And they really helped restructure the Grenadian health system. You know, the mortality rates went way down. They built, I believe, a few hospitals, and the healthcare of Grenadians went up massively. But that was essentially it. It was the healthcare, and the airport were the biggest changes, really.
What was the internal factor then that brought Grenada to the US intervention? What happened internally that brought about more foreign interest?
Yeah, well, there was within this new Joel movement, as I mentioned earlier, it was made up of two left-wing movements, right? One of them was more militaristic, and the other one was not. It was more economic focused. And Bishop was the leader of the branch that was more focused on economics and building the state up, establishing a reputation and a repertoire on the international scene, whereas the other half, led by Bernard Coward, sorry, him and his group were a lot more militaristic. And again, while Bishop was away, I believe he was in India when this happened, at a meeting for the non-aligned movement. They once again essentially executed the same coup that Bishop had a few years prior. And so Bishop, of course, rushed back and was placed under house arrest, 24-hour surveillance, and then broke out after a few days, with his supporters, which was still the overwhelming majority of people on the island. And they went on a big protest march throughout the capital of St. George's, and then were rounded up by Coward and his military, and were shot. So 12 of the leaders of Bishop's side of the movement were shot, including him and his pregnant wife.
So how long after this coup after the infighting within the left, came the invasion itself? How long got the new government in power?
I believe it was a week maximum. I'd have to check that. But I believe it was not even, yeah, a week maximum, maybe not even a week. This coup happened in October, and by October 25th, 1983, the US was on the ground fighting in Grenada. I believe it was just a few days.
Was this more of an opportunistic approach? What triggered the intervention itself? Why did they could have intervened anytime in the past 6 years, 5, 6 years? What changed that made the US finally intervene?
I think it was Reagan's hardline stance against the spread of left-wing governments, communism, Marxism, you name it, anything that didn't align with his conservative American values, that was in our sphere of in the American sphere of influence. I think it comes back to the Monroe Doctrine a bit as well. Stay out of our half of the world, we'll stay out of yours, kind of situation. The main push came actually from a completely different direction, and in fact, it came in fact from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. This was 8 Eastern Caribbean states. I believe it's the last of the Windward Islands, so just north of South America. All 7 other states, Grenada was a member state. All 7 other states said, hey, these guys and their new government now, they pose what we see as a threat, because the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States was very much pro-American, very much looking northwards, was not looking eastwards, was not looking towards Cuba. And so they reached out to the U.S. There's still debate if this was set up by the CIA, this agreement to go in. I'd have to look into that more as well. But they reached out to the U.S., sent them an agreement, a document, and said, "Hey, we need your help. Come help us put somebody in who's more aligned with our values and can stand with us, and we can bring the organization back together, essentially." And that obviously came to Reagan Express, right? It came very fast. And within 3 days of receiving that notice, the U.S. had troops on the ground.
How natural is that? How fast can you respond to a call from an international organization? You should have been ready for that. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of the response times of military organizations or naval organizations operating in certain regions, but logically, 3 days, 3 or 4 days seems like a short time frame, quite a short time frame. Would it be an exaggeration to ask you whether they might have been possibly informed beforehand? Were they waiting for this? How ready were they for this?
Yeah, I mean, it's an extremely short time plan. We never see this anywhere in military operations. You don't just get news 3 days before an operation and come up with something in those 3 days. That would be insane. And the U.S. definitely, had plans for this dating from 1979, from the original coup. And they had simply just been waiting for the green light, waiting for Bishop to ramp up his attacks against the U.S., because then he comes into the attention of the average American. They'll start seeing him in the New York Times. They'll start seeing him in their newspapers, on the radio, on TV. So they're aware of what's happening, and then they'll get riled up, and it just gives Reagan the perfect timing to go in and take this plan that he's had, and the message from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States essentially just gave him the green light to go in. And it helped as well that this happened just around the exact same time as the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. So there was already an aircraft carrier underway towards the Mediterranean that had just left Norfolk, the main naval base for the U.S. on the East Coast, just a few days prior, and they were just immediately redirected towards Grenada.
So they changed their operational priority. They were going to the Mediterranean and they turned to Grenada. Would they? I'm straying from the paper itself a bit, but I'm just curious. What does this mean for the greater US foreign policy? Were they more comfortable in the Middle East than they were in Grenada if an attack just happened? How much of a priority does Grenada have to be so you divert a naval force to Grenada that was supposed to be going to the Middle East if you were attacked recently?
I mean, I don't. Obviously the Mediterranean was crucial. I believe we already had an aircraft carrier there, as that is one of the areas of the world where even today there's always a U.S. aircraft carrier or some form of a U.S. fleet that can provide aid wherever it's needed, or take action militarily. So we had an aircraft carrier there, I believe, and they were already delivering aid.
I just want to say that we are very aware that you have a constant presence in the Mediterranean. I'm sorry. Yeah.
If
Yeah,
I could add, John, I'm sorry. If I could add, U.S. has constant presence in the MENA region, Middle Eastern, North Africa region, Near East, as of I believe early 1950s. So I think a single aircraft carrier wouldn't change much regarding the response to the Beirut crisis.
all jokes aside, it does make sense. If it wasn't such a critical force that was diverted to Grenada, it makes sense then. Okay.
Yeah. And it was simply also a quick operation. If you look at the operational timeline for Operation Urgent Fury, which was the invasion of Grenada, it was really only a 5-day operation. In military terms, that's lightning quick. And so with the flexibility of an aircraft carrier, the transit was not really slowed down much. So the carrier that was in the Mediterranean simply had to stay on station for another week, for an extra week.
So what triggered the invasion was the call from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean Islands. Am I
Eastern
saying
Caribbean states,
states?
so OECS.
Okay. So the US was very ready to intervene. How did the operation happen? And aside from the second coup in Grenada, did any kind of other event trigger the intervention itself? There was the coup, there was the call for help, and that was it?
That was essentially it. The increased violence of this new militaristic government also raised some alarm bells. There was and still is an American medical university on the island of Grenada. I don't know how it got there, but it's there. You know, there were a thousand American students on the island at the time, and that also, of course, played perfectly into Reagan's playbook, with his fear mongering, saying that these students are on lockdown 24/7. They can't go anywhere. They're running out of food. Really painting a dire view of the whole situation there.
How did the operation take place then? Could you tell us about how it unfolded?
Yeah. I didn't do too much research on the operation itself, but I can give you like a basic overview of it. So obviously we have the carrier strike force, and the Marines as well, were there. So and the 82nd Airborne as well. Very prestigious units of the U.S. They had been training for months prior. Operation Ocean Venture, in 1981. They practiced some paratrooper assaults in Washington State a few months prior to this as well. And the first wave came via helicopter. It was just a surprise attack, a small amount. I believe it was three helicopters. So not too many men, but that was just to secure a beachhead around this airport being built in the southwest of Grenada. And then from there on, the fighting progressed northward. It was quite slow, since Grenada is a jungle island, and if you look at it topographically, it is very mountainous, lots of deep valleys, dense forests, very humid, not really the kind of like area that you want to fight in and wage a war. And getting places took time. The country was very underdeveloped. Think of it in that sense as almost a miniature Vietnam, which is ironic because this was an operation pushed by Reagan to get rid of the Vietnamization of the U.S. military, which was essentially the loss of public faith in the U.S. military, after the Vietnam War, after that 12 years of quagmire and getting stuck in Southeast Asia without a clear victory either way.
Do you know anything about the operational capabilities of the Grenadian military? How much of a resistance could they put up?
Yeah, so they didn't put up too much of a resistance. They had a lot of weapons, but they didn't have a lot of soldiers. I believe they once again, had around 1,000 soldiers, and then you count the Cubans as well. So about 2,700 total fighting against the U.S. So it's an incredible disparity there, and there weren't too many deaths military deaths at least. There were civilian deaths, numerous civilian deaths on the Grenadian side. The U.S. Navy bombed a mental hospital by accident, which killed 25 patients, I believe, and of course other shootings, bombings, and attacks. But the U.S. only lost 19 men. But yeah, no, the capacity of the Grenadians to really fight back was simply just not there, which was also a huge portion of a huge factor in why it was such a short operation. I guarantee that if there was some capability to fight back, and Bishop wanted an army of 10,000, and for an island of 110,000, that's significant. And he was building up to that. He had the weapons for that. He didn't have the men. But if he had that, for example, it would have become almost a second Vietnam with this dense countryside and the lack of U.S. intelligence going into the operation. Um, Many of the commanders themselves didn't even know where the U.S. university was, which is a stunning oversight by the U.S. intelligence community to ignore that.
Can I quote you on some numbers?
Yeah.
In paper you say the assault involved 1,900 Marines and Army Rangers along with 300 troops, and you are saying casualties were generally light. The Americans suffered 19 killed and 116 wounded, and Cubans suffered 25 dead, 56 wounded, and 538 captured. Grenada itself suffered 45 killed, 358 wounded, and at least 24 civilians killed. At least 24 civilians killed. How long did the fighting take to end?
Well, most of the fighting was done within the first 3 days. I mean, obviously there was still fighting going on the fifth day, but the last 2 days were essentially pushing up past the real population points of the island. If you look at the island on Google Maps or anywhere, you'll see most of the population, probably about 80% of it, wild guess, is in the south, and that's where the big cities are. And so that's where you're going to get into potential urban warfare, and where it's going to take where it would take longer to progress through. And then the north is where it gets very, very rural, little villages here and there along the coastline, and the whole interior of the island was all mountains. So after the third day, roughly, there wasn't too much fighting going on.
Alex, how did the US actually justify this to the, international scene, to its allies and such, the rest of the world?
Yeah, they justified it in a very strange way. They used this request from the OECS as part of their argument in the UN, saying these are our allies. They came to us for assistance, so we helped them out. And they also played off of the good old Cold War, East versus West, capitalism, communism argument, of course, with Cuban, with the amount of aid that Grenada got from Cuba, that was very easy to play. But if you look at the votes in the UN, across the board, it was overwhelmingly condemning the U.S. actions. I believe it was 109 votes against the U.S. and 17 for it. And that was mainly coming from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the U.S., of course, and I think the one outlier there was Israel.
Yeah.
That's it. So
The votes for and against were 108 to 9.
so those 9 would have been the 7
Yeah.
OECS states, the U.S. and Israel, which
I mean, Israel is pretty much given considering Reagan's politics regarding Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I was going to ask this one at the end, but I can't wait for your answer right now because Do you think it would be different if Carter administration was in charge when this happens? Because Carter was quite different from Reagan, and their difference is pretty much seen on the Middle East, Camp David Accords between Israel and Palestinians, and considering Reagan's previous and at that point what was going to do, what he would do in the Gulf War and such. One is a dove, one is a hawk regarding the U.S. Foreign policies. So, do you think it would be different if Carter was in charge?
I think it would have been quite different. Like I mentioned at the start, his policy was very humanitarian. He did not care where you stood on the political spectrum, who your allies were. If you reach out to the US, you were most likely going to get aid. And I think that would have been because Grenada did reach out to the US for aid. They just did it at the wrong time. And of course, then Reagan said, "No, we're not going to support you." He said, I'm very much anti-communist, anti-left wing, as the neoconservative he was, and so it would have been very, very different, I believe, under Carter. Of course, we can't say for certain. It could have still come to military operation, and I think it very well could have if Bishop had kept up his rhetoric. He was already starting to go after the U.S. For not extending the offer of military and economic aid during Carter's regime. So if that had kept up, if that had escalated, it very well could have become a military operation. But I think it would have been a lot more diplomatic and a lot more humanitarian under Carter.
What changed in the island after the invasion? For one, what changed geopolitically in the region? And secondly, or you can invert the order of these questions. What changed within the island and what changed in the region geographically, geopolitically?
Yeah, so not too much actually changed on the island. Of course, they got a pro-US, they got a pro-US government, and US aid started flooding in. It is quite interesting to see Reagan's speeches after the invasion. He goes to Grenada in 1986 and essentially boosts his own ego, says, if I didn't come in and save you guys from this evil, I wouldn't be here. We're the best of friends. We're the best buddies in the Caribbean, and all that. And it's quite interesting to see. And if you look at if you look at these videos, they're available online on the Reagan Presidential Library, Library of Congress, honestly everywhere, even on YouTube. But if you look at these, there's hundreds of cheering Grenadians cheering for him when he says this stuff, and I think that's just 3 years after this operation is quite a difference in the outlook of the average Grenadian. But other than that, not too much change. Grenada was still developing. The biggest change, I believe, was that the roads were paved. The main roads became paved. I believe that was one of the bigger differences. Again, I'd have to look into that. Didn't look into that too much. Looked more into the broader scheme of things. And as for the geopolitics, it did actually have a huge impact. It put Cuba in its place. Cuba realized, okay, the U.S. is not messing around here. We can't meddle as much as we want. So it essentially took Cuba's free hand in the Caribbean away, as they had a bit of a free hand under Carter because he was a little bit more relaxed towards Latin America and Central America during his administration compared to Reagan. But we see the same trend that we see in Grenada. We see it happen again in Panama under Bush, who was Reagan's vice president at the time of Grenada. And then we see again, it wasn't a military invasion, but it was still explicit U.S. threats to a South American government in 2020 with Trump threatening Venezuela directly with military action. So it's changed a lot of the situation. Now there are scholars writing about, oh, is the Monroe Doctrine back? And is it not just dead? Because the argument was once the Cold War started, the Monroe Doctrine had essentially died out because the sides had already kind of been chosen. But now there's a big argument that is the Monroe Doctrine really back? Does the invasion of Grenada mark the start of a new chapter in U.S. Caribbean and U.S. South American relations? Is this a different form of Monroe Doctrine? There's a lot of questions out there now as to the geopolitical scene, and also reassured a lot of the third world, or made it depended on obviously in which way the countries were facing, east or west. But if they were more pro-American, this reassured them that the Americans would help. And the other way around, it also, like it did with Cuba, to a lesser extent, it raised alarm bells in countries facing towards the Soviet Union.
As far as I can remember, the early 1980s was a period of relative escalation in the tensions between the East and West. So this was a huge show of force, you're saying. And how successful was it in wiping out the Vietnam syndrome? Because I did a presentation on the Gulf War, and one of the main takeaways from the Gulf War was it completely wiped away the Vietnam syndrome. How successful was Grenada in the rehabilitation of the American military might, let's say?
I think obviously, since like you said, with the Vietnamization really was still prevalent during the Gulf War, it did not go away. But it was far less significant after Grenada, because the average American after Vietnam said, oh, we sent our military halfway across the world to a country that people don't know, there's no real connection to Vietnam. It's not really strategically important. Now looking back on it, it's not necessarily strategically important for the U.S. to invest 500,000 men and 500,000 deaths into Vietnam. And I think the overwhelming show of force in Grenada did help ease the American public into saying, oh, our military's back on track. They're doing the right thing. They're protecting freedom. They're limiting the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence. They're keeping Cuba in check. I think it was a very much needed morale booster for the public, and you don't see any there's no protests against Grenada, really. There weren't any open mass protests like what we saw in Vietnam for the Vietnam War. It definitely helped. It obviously got condemnation from Democratic senators and the lefter-leaning part of the American political spectrum. But even then, that was essentially insignificant. I mean, it didn't change what Reagan did. And after a few months, a lot of these people who were condemning the invasion, many of them were senators, were congressmen, they went down to Grenada itself and said, it's good that we were here. So I think it did help reduce that Vietnamization. Obviously, it didn't take it away, but I think it really did help reduce that down.
When you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, one part of the doctrine was, saying the old Europeans just stay out of American continent. It's our business now. And the second part was U.S. pledge to stay out of European affairs and European conflicts. But it did right opposite of that. Even the isolationist period of the Roosevelt, up until Pearl Harbor and such, and especially after the Second World War. How does that fit into that doctrine's role in the U.S. foreign policy?
Well, that's where the argument comes from that after the Second World War, was the Monroe Doctrine really still a thing? Was this still our policy? I mean, like you said, the U.S. was very isolationist for the war, stayed out of it for the most part until Pearl Harbor. But then after that, as the most powerful Western country, and I think you can make a very good argument that the Monroe Doctrine died there, as the U.S. felt like it needed to exert its influence over Europe, especially Eastern Europe at the time, and also shore up interests in Japan, um, and Southeast Asia. But I think you can make a very good argument for saying the Monroe Doctrine ceased to exist, and in a way that's true. But you can also say, it went away for until the 1980s, or it came back in a different form, to Monroe Doctrine 2.0, in a way, just a little less economic and a little bit more military. But that's still obviously an ongoing debate. I haven't read too much into that. I'm sure it's fascinating as well. But you can make an argument that it went away right after the Second World War, and that it was an old policy. It was already well over 100 years old at that rate. So that it was thrown out would make sense as well.
You say in your paper that Operation Urgent Fury marked the last time that the US was able to justify a direct unilateral military intervention using the Cold War national security doctrine that was anti-communism. Could we say this was the final show of force, final anti-communist show of force of the US in the region that really asserted its dominance, let's say, and curbed Cuban ambitions? Would that be a correct takeaway, or what's your takeaway from the whole thing?
No, I think we can definitely say that after 1983, we don't see too much Cuban influence anymore in the Caribbean. They're still there, obviously, and they're still trying to exert their influence, but they take a back seat in the world affairs in the region. This reestablishes the U.S. as the dominant power, shows the countries in the region that the U.S. is willing to go in to protect its interests, and potentially the interests of your state, or not if you're Cuba. But you still see leftist movements, left-wing movements, just radical movements in general, rising up against the established states in Central America. You have Panama, you have Nicaragua, and among others. And it's still ongoing, but there's not too much Cuban influence to speak of after 1983. They kind of fade into the background.
What does this time period and Operation Urgent Fury mean to you? Not on a personal level, maybe, but academically or scientifically, from the perspective of a historian. What's your main takeaway? What are you left with after working on this for so long and so thoroughly?
I think the main takeaway is that if you look at it from an American's perspective, I try to stay as neutral as I can. As an American, it's sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's not hard. But I tried to stay as neutral as I could. I think if you're looking at it from the outside in, it shows that, like I just said, the Americans are willing to go in to protect their interests wherever need be. They don't mind using their military. We've obviously seen this change a bit in the past few years. It's escalated as well. But I think it marks a very big change, obviously, in the Cold War itself. You know, it sets the tone for the start of the end of the Cold War, um, with the U.S. saying, you know, we're not afraid to go in after the humiliation we had in Vietnam. We're not afraid to try this again, see if it works, and we will make sure it will work. Um, and I think that sends a very interesting, very strong signal to two countries in the Soviet orbit, and the Cuban orbit as well.
Actually, I'm wondering about how it is reflected in the modern historiography, in the Cold War studies and such. You know, what kind of researches have been made on that?
Yeah, so a lot of what I found has been very, very critical of the invasion. You know, lining up with this UN vote that we see, almost in a sense, not hyper critical, but obviously very, very critical of the U.S. actions. You know, it half the articles I read for this were arguing it wasn't legit, it was an illegitimate invasion. It shouldn't have happened. It was the U.S. overstepping, that the CIA had made up this document, or this request from the OECS, and I believe that's still a controversy today. If it is actually, well, if it wasn't just a CIA brief that they sent to the OECS and said, "Hey, sign this so we can go in," or if it was coming from the OECS themselves. Um, but no, a lot of the literature I found was very, very critical. You know, it was a lot of Black scholars, a lot of scholars from the Caribbean, left-leaning scholars. I mean, one of the sources I found was from a Marxist magazine. So you know, very, very critical of the invasion, which is an interesting view, because I had a lot of stuff from the U.S., from Reagan's archives, that, you know, painted it as this godsend that America came and saved the struggling people of Grenada. So I think the historiography is very, very split. But if you look at it internationally, if you ignore a lot of what the domestic historiography on this is in the US, if you look at it internationally, it's a lot more critical of the invasion. I think as time goes on, as we get more and more information on the invasion, there's already a good amount out there, but I think as more comes to light, as we see more, it'll become even more critical.
This has been extremely enlightening. I had a lot of fun listening to you. I hope we had some at least interesting questions that could enrich the discussion. I enjoyed it immensely, and it was a delight having you here with us. Thank you so much. Many thanks for sharing your research with us. Let's hope this marks the beginning of many international videos that we can make, that can maybe broaden our horizons a bit, especially seeing as Turkey can get a little bit isolated intellectually. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I liked talking. I mean, I could talk about this for hours, so I absolutely loved it as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you to whoever watched this video. Many thanks, and let's see you in the next video.